I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the great inconvenience of your trip being interrupted to be charged a few bucks just to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged-up freeway with lines of cars packed together waiting to pay and move on. I can imagine the people who work at those booths find it even more boring than you do. The toll booth I operate, however, couldn't be further from the stereotype. It is situated on a small country road that curves a few times along its path through the surrounding woods, far away from any bustling highway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack with chipped paint and an old sign that reads 25 cents, an amount I don't believe has changed since sometime in the 1950s. Its only accessory is the barrier arm I can flip up or down. The interior is simple, with a single chair and a light on the ceiling, the only light besides the moon for miles. It only has one operator on any given night. Most nights that's me. On the surface, it doesn't make sense why our local government would pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere to operate a booth that makes no money. But if you spent a single night out there, you would understand why. There isn't a sudden influx of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at 3 a.m. What we protect by keeping this booth running is worth far more than any monetary cost could make up for. In my town, the job of operating the lonely booth is one that is highly respected and rarely spoken of. In fact, it's something of an unspoken rule that you keep private any conversations about the booth, the road, or anything related. Everyone around here knows there's something off about this place. Almost everyone has seen something they can't explain or something they wish they hadn't. A lot of rural towns have their own urban legends, but most of the time their residents embrace the myths. Our town is the opposite. We keep quiet about the things we've seen. The most we can do around here is to steer people clear of the road and hope nothing strays from it. The last thing we want is for the rest of the world to find out. Our town is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to crumble or degrade. Our public schools are well funded, and no one is ever stuck looking for work. This is noteworthy because our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous region of America. This money is coming from somewhere, and it's not from our little property taxes. I've got a suspicion that the feds or someone else is dumping money into our town, and that they're keeping tabs on our little toll booth situation as well. Each week we hold a private meeting at our town hall. In attendance are all current toll booth attendants and any former ones who can make it. Most of the time, the meetings don't last longer than 15 minutes, but after the emergency meeting I called a few weeks ago, we've held them every day, and they've been taking a lot longer. The reason for which you will know soon enough. I suppose this is a good time to explain what happens at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. Rule 1. The booth does not need to be attended during the day. Not much happens at the booth when the sun is up, but the attendant for the night, which is usually me, must be at the booth an hour before sunset and stay an hour after sunrise. The attendant for the night is not to leave the booth at any time during their shift for any reason. Rule 2. No cell phone, radio, or other electronic or communication device is allowed while operating the booth at night. The only thing running on electricity that a booth attendant is allowed to have is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device accidentally, shut it off, store it inside the booth, and pray that it doesn't turn itself back on. Leaving it outside the booth is not an option. Should your device turn itself on inside the booth, your next best bet is to destroy it. This sounds like a drastic measure, but I've made this mistake before. Rule 3. Rare as they are, cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. A common trait among those who end up on this road at night is confusion. The attendant's job is to decide whether they will be let through or turned away. The driver, along with confusion, may express other emotions. They may be distressed, angry, paranoid, or fearful. Try to calm them down and put their minds at ease as best you can. Once you believe they are ready, you will simply ask them to pay their toll. One of two outcomes will occur if the driver has no notable reaction, questions you, or hands you a regular quarter. You must leave the barrier arm down and turn them away. Do whatever is necessary to try and make them leave. If they threaten you or attempt to drive through anyway, you can let them know you will be calling the police, even though you have no means of calling them. This scenario is unlikely because no modern navigation system would bring them down this road. All of the locals know not to use it, and it would be unusual for an outsider to learn about it, though we have on occasion had to deal with a few lost travelers. Most of the time they are compliant. Get them off the road as soon as possible and direct them towards town where they can get their footing. Above all else, they cannot pass through the gate. However, if you ask them to pay their toll, another outcome is possible, and unfortunately the most common. They'll come to a sudden realization, as evidenced by their facial expression. It's as if they remember something. Slowly reaching into their pocket and pulling out a black coin, they know they'll have to give it to you to pass. Some accept their fate graciously, others cry, but they all follow the road once the barrier arm is lifted, driving around the corner, never to be seen again. In my first months working here, I was confused as to who these people were, what it was they knew, how they got these coins in the first place, or what the coins were. All I knew was to leave it in the booth to be picked up by the next shift. This was until I happened to be watching the local news one morning after I got home. They talked about a man who was killed in a car accident the night before, and showed a picture of his face, a face I had seen only hours before, puzzled and afraid as he asked me where he was and what was going on. When I asked him for his toll, he froze, slowly reached into his coat pocket with a quivering hand and pulled out a black coin before placing it in mine. He gripped the steering wheel and faced forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was going. Sitting in my living room that morning, recounting the events of the last hours, I realized that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead, just passing through, as were the dozens I had seen before, and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I realized the road was some kind of path to where beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so surreal that in the moment, all you can do is let autopilot take over and continue with your duties as you were told. But as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades back, a visitor from out of town was passing through town. Back then, he didn't have a phone to give him directions, so he had to go off a map. Even with a map, I'm certain he didn't know of the road because it was never put on any map. My best guess is that he happened to see it and figured it could be some sort of a shortcut. When he approached the gate, he was of course turned away by the toll booth attendant, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man got violent with the attendant, pushing him over and raising the arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the past attendants of the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night, the same man in the same car rolled up to the booth. When asked for his toll, this time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, only knowing that he needed to pass through, but not why. This has continued every night for the last several decades. Each night he pulls up confused as to why he's here and needs to pass, and forgetting each time. Each night he gives us a coin. Each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, not seen until the next night. He never ages. and his appearance never changes. Sometimes he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times he expresses a sense that he's been here before and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but not the only one. Rule 4. At some random point in the night, you may hear something moving through the trees, something big. Sometimes they emerge from the woods. Other times they'll be coming down the road. Try not to be afraid no harm is coming your way, quite the opposite. However, I can see how this would be hard to believe. In any case, you need to raise the arm and let them through. I remember the first time I saw them. I could hear a clop somewhere down the road, coming towards the booth, like a horse galloping. I rose to my feet and grabbed my flashlight, intrigued. I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse, as I had never been told what to do in that scenario. When I did point my flashlight at the road, I nearly had a heart attack at the sight before me a bull moose was approaching with a brisk walk. Of course I was warned of this, but the details I was given were vague. All I was told was that a moose might approach the gate, and I was supposed to let it through. I wasn't told that this thing stands at around 9 or 10 feet at the shoulder, or that its fur is so dark I couldn't see it without my flashlight, save for the massive antlers which are white as snow in contrast. The only other part of its body clearly visible from afar were its eyes, which shone with a small speck of white light glowing in the darkness. I screamed and retreated to my booth, tempted to run off into the night and abandon my post. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm. This calmed me down and I slowly raised it, watching as the moose approached to pass. As it did, I noticed the halter and reins on its head. I followed them up, only to meet another set of eyes identical to the moose's, towering over me. Again I yelled, but contained my volume when I realized whoever or whatever this was on top of the moose was making eye contact with me as they passed. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose it rode on, something akin to a shadow. Just like everyone in their cars, they walked down the road beyond the bend and out of sight. I had to sit down for half an hour before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy those finer details had been left out. Only after my shift and expressing my frustration was I told more. Apparently this hunter and his moose have been around a long time, so long that no attendant alive today can remember a time without them. Some believe they've been here for the past couple hundred years or more, possibly as long as the strange road and the booth have been around. What we do know is that they aren't bound to the road like the others. At our town hall, we possess a written account of the hunter and his mount riding right through town in the middle of the night back in 1919. To this day, a few residents have seen the moose while they're driving at night. You may be wondering why I refer to the figure on the moose's back as the hunter. Well, that's what us attendants call him. Every so often, he and his moose will arrive at the booth, dragging a corpse behind them. When I say corpse, I don't mean an animal or even a human. I mean abominations out of your wildest nightmares, things that send a shiver down your spine and make you want to vomit at the same time, things you would expect to find talked about in a religious text when the end of days comes. The hunter drags these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be certain of anything, but if you ask me, he's taking them back to some sort of afterlife or underworld. Maybe it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve, or maybe somewhere in the road is a pathway to many different places. I couldn't tell you what I believe, like the other attendants and anyone who knows about the hunter and his moose, that they're here to protect us. Whatever these things are that he's taking with him aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and he's just here to set things right. Now, this is where we get to the point why I'm telling you about all of this. I explained before that the people from my town like to keep these things quiet, and for the most part, I agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a couple of weeks ago during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going well for the most part. No new dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular, poor old bastard, confused as ever. After him, all was quiet for a few hours until I heard a slow clop coming down the road yet again. These days, I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't fear either of them, and like I said, I've come to respect them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're dragging out. That night was no exception. They approached the gate and stopped in front of it. Before I moved to raise the barrier arm, I shone my flashlight at the rope being dragged behind, and the dreadful thing attached to the end of the rope. It was tied in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves that belonged to what looked like the lower half of some sort of deer. As I moved up the body with my flashlight, I quickly discovered that this wasn't just some massive buck. The legs may have been reminiscent of one, but the upper body was that of a man in a striped red and blue clown suit. The sleeves were shredded at the wrist, and protruding from them were long, blackened hands with claws for fingers. The head was by far the most grotesque part. Its nose and mouth, like the rest of its head, were covered in skin like that of a pale man, but their shape was that of a deer's. Blood dripped out of its half-open mouth. The ears were similar, with the same pale color and texture as a man's, but shaped like a deer's. On top sat a red and blue jester hat, and a set of antlers sprouting out above them. I froze for a moment upon seeing the entirety of this beast, but snapped out of it when I reminded myself that I had a job to do, and that I better do it if I didn't want to see this thing any longer. I walked over to the barrier arm and raised it. The moose resumed its trot forward along the road and past the gate. As they passed me, I couldn't help but watch the deer clown monster it was dragging behind a streak of blood followed on the road behind it. Right before it passed by the booth completely, I lit up its face with my flashlight to get a final look. Its eyelids shot open, revealing the black and brown eyes underneath. Then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, pain-filled bleat before leaning down and clawing at the knot holding its hooves. In only a few seconds, the ropes were cut, and the beast attempted to stand. It didn't get far in its initial attempt, however, because the bull moose in front of it struck its head with a powerful kick. Another splash of blood came from the clown's mouth, along with one of its teeth, as it fell back to the ground, seemingly knocked out for a moment while it recovered. The hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on. I ran from the booth and hid behind a tree to the side of the road, but kept an eye on the fight. Air shot from the moose's nostrils. As it began to grunt, its grunts were louder and deeper than the bleats of the deer clown. I could feel my chest vibrate with each powerful grunt. The clown finally stood and stared back at the hunter and moose, letting a few more bleats out as if to challenge them. At its standing height, this thing was taller than the moose, though it was obvious the moose was much larger and heavier overall. The moose lowered its head and charged. Before it connected, the clown thing attempted to claw at the hunter on its back, but failed. It was picked up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away with the hunter holding the new rope, and they began to drag the clown by the neck, hoping to finally make it around the bend. Unfortunately, it was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws again. The clown didn't waste any time, hurrying to its hooves and charging into the woods. The hunter on his moose followed, and in only a moment they were both out of sight. I only noticed my heavy breathing after all was quiet again. It took me an hour to work up the courage to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed the tooth from the clown lying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the drive, I contacted everyone else and told them to get there as soon as possible. At the meeting, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a mix of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and none knew what it meant. The agreed-upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week, so we figured he would catch the clown in the next couple of days. I dearly wish that was what happened. A day later, a video surfaced on the internet from the town over. It showed a pair of deer antlers sticking out above the tops of trees as the man recording was driving. A few days after that, another video. This one was recorded by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to laughter outside. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and part of the hat outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but commenters on the video sure did. Last week, someone halfway across the state uploaded a grainy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees, far off in the distance. These are just the ones I've seen. Now you can see why we've been having meetings every week. I can tell we're not the only ones in a panic either. Strangers started showing up around town, and not the kind that are just passing through. They tried their best to fit in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaway is when they show up to our bars and diners, striking up a conversation before asking folk what they've seen around here lately, asking about the booth and the strange road. In the last week or so, they've stopped trying so hard to hide it. Black government SUVs have been crowding the parking spaces downtown. We kept the tooth in the town hall, along with every other document and record we have about the booth, and now it's all missing. It's clear that whatever happened that night wasn't supposed to, and we weren't the only ones who noticed. I didn't work last night, but the attendant who did had a lot to report this morning in our meeting. The feds drove out to the booth and took a look around. He pleaded with them not to drive through, but in response, they told him they already knew why they shouldn't. Something we weren't expecting. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. I suppose I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. As much as we like to keep it a secret in our town, the genie is out of the bottle. I figured I would at least tell all of you before the feds. Every one of you should know what's out there. As for me, I'll keep watching the booth at night, sticking to my duties. It's about all I can do. Still, I'll be keeping up with all of the developments that I can. I can only guess based on the posts I've strung together, but it looks like the clown is still on the move and our hunter close behind. I can only pray that he catches it soon. In the meantime, if you hear strange laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside. I've noticed an alarming trend in the past few years. The number of viral videos showing unruly and violent behavior by airline passengers seems to be constantly on the rise. It's become a weekly, if not daily, occurrence to see incidents of passengers screaming, shouting, and even getting into physical altercations with other travelers and flight staff. While it may be entertaining to watch these videos from the comfort of home, the reality is that I've had to deal with these kinds of unhinged passengers far too often in my job at the airport. I can't even count the number of times I've had to call security to handle a rowdy or aggressive customer. The triggers for these outbursts are often shockingly minor and avoidable: someone not getting their turn, a perceived slight, a crying baby, or even something as trivial as the last chocolate donut being taken. The abuse I and my coworkers have endured has really taken its toll. Tired of dealing with these volatile situations, I started searching for a new job. While I had extensive experience in the airline industry, I was worried my options would be limited. However, during a late-night job search, I came across a listing for a tiny regional airport in the Midwest. The airport seemed tiny, with just a couple runways and a single terminal, which sounded like a perfect fit to avoid the chaos of a major hub. The job details were exactly the same as my current role, but with one key difference: it paid significantly more than I was making. Excited by the prospect of higher pay and less stressful work environment, I quickly applied. To my surprise, the manager, James, reached out the very next day requesting an interview over Zoom. The interview went extremely well. James came across as warm and friendly, and seemed eager to have me start as soon as possible. When he offered me the job on the spot, I was initially taken aback, but James assured me they didn't have any other applicants, and that he was confident I was the right fit. Eager to leave my current situation, I agreed to a start date just over a week away, despite the standard protocol of giving 2 weeks' notice. My final shift at the old airport was a nightmare, as I had to deal with yet another aggressive passenger incident. As soon as my shift ended, I hurried home to prepare for the move. The long drive went smoothly, and I arrived at the tiny Midwest airport with just minutes to spare before the start of my first shift. As I entered the terminal, I was struck by how small and quaint the entire facility was, a stark contrast to the bustling hubs I was used to. James greeted me eagerly and led me to the employee locker room to get changed into my new uniform. He then handed me a fresh cup of coffee and a single sheet of paper, explaining it contained important instructions I needed to review. With that, he apologized for having to rush off, mentioning that he'd been on duty for 17 hours already. As I watched James and the rest of the airport staff depart, leaving me completely alone in the terminal, I began to feel a sense of unease. It struck me as highly unusual that I would be the sole employee on site, especially for such an extended night shift. Nonetheless, I turned my attention to the laminated instructions James had provided. The 6 rules outlined on the sheet were ... peculiar, to say the least. They range from keeping all the lights on at all times to specific instructions about a young woman named Elizabeth and a janitor named Simon, to warnings about a mysterious black and red plane that would spontaneously appear on the runway. I couldn't help but wonder if this was all some kind of prank or test. As I stood contemplating the instructions, I was startled by the sudden appearance of a young woman, Elizabeth, as described in the rules. She greeted me warmly and tried to engage me in conversation, but I stubbornly refused to break the rules. Over the next few hours, Elizabeth continued her attempts to interact, even bringing me a magazine, while the janitor Simon also appeared and carried out his duties without incident. Just after 1:30 a.m., things took a disturbing turn. Elizabeth suddenly began violently bleeding from her eyes and nose before lashing out and hurling one of her heavy suitcases at me. I managed to dodge it and took refuge in the men's restroom, as the instructions had advised. From behind the locked door, I heard Elizabeth's manic laughter and the unsettling sounds of other voices. Eventually, the ordeal ended, and the janitor Simon returned to check on me and offer some reassurance. But the night was far from over. Shortly after, a group of heavily armed men identifying themselves as TSA agents stormed the airport demanding I allow them access to the air bridge, something the instructions explicitly forbade. When I refused, they opened fire, and I blacked out. I awoke to find James standing over me, offering me a bonus payment for completing my first night. He acknowledged the absurdity of the situation but insisted that I had no choice but to witness it for myself. Faced with the decision to either leave or stay, I ultimately chose to remain and finish the onboarding process, intrigued by the bizarre events and eager to better understand what I had just experienced. As I finished the onboarding paperwork with James, he provided some additional context around the strange occurrences at the airport. I know it's a lot to take in, and you have every right to be angry that I didn't warn you ahead of time. But the truth is, if I had, you never would have believed me. This place, it's just not normal. James went on to explain that the airport was haunted by supernatural forces that manifested in unpredictable ways. Elizabeth, the young woman I encountered, was a spirit who had become trapped there. Simon the janitor was another entity that seemed relatively benign, but the TSA agents were a dangerous group of armed mercenaries who would periodically raid the airport, searching for something. And then there's the plane. James shuddered. I wish I understood it better, but that Cessna is something else entirely. All I know is you can't take your eyes off it, or it won't end well. As unnerving as all of this was, I found myself strangely intrigued. The idea of working in a paranormal-infused airport, dealing with ghostly figures and shadowy intruders, was a far cry from the mundane frustrations of my previous job. And the higher pay James was offering was certainly tempting. Look, I get it if you want to walk away from this, James said. No one would blame you. But if you're willing to stick it out, I can guarantee you won't be bored. And trust me, you'll be a lot safer here than in one of those overcrowded airports. I thought it over for a moment, then made my decision. I'll do what I told him. Just try to warn me a little more next time, okay? James let out a relieved laugh. Welcome aboard. Now, get some rest, you're going to need it for tonight's shift. And so began my new career at the most bizarre airport in the country. Each night brought new challenges, from fending off Elizabeth's volatile outbursts to evading the TSA raiders. But in a strange way, I found a sense of purpose in navigating these supernatural trials. The work was certainly never dull, and I took pride in my ability to calmly follow the rules and procedures James had outlined. Over time, I even developed a rapport with the eccentric cast of characters that inhabited the airport, including the elusive plane and its mysterious pilot. Of course, there were still plenty of harrowing moments, but with each night shift survived, I grew more confident in my ability to handle the airport's paranormal elements. And the generous pay allowed me to save up with the eventual goal of transferring to a more normal facility. For now, though, I was content to remain at this strange little airport, embracing the bizarre challenges that came with the job. After all, where else could I get paid so well to deal with ghosts, monsters, and government spooks? It was certainly a far cry from the tedium of my old position, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I work in retail, and one of my tasks is receiving shipments, which means interacting with the truck drivers who deliver them. It's a job that requires a lot of organization, but also demands a friendly attitude since I spend so much time around the drivers. Most of them are older men, in their 40s to 60s, while I'm a woman in my mid-20s, which is relevant to the story. Generally, the drivers are professional and helpful. However, there was one driver who was oddly talkative and often shared irrelevant or mildly inappropriate stories, like tales from his college days or details about his ex-girlfriends. I assumed he was simply outgoing and a bit quirky, so I responded politely, as I would with anyone. But then a male coworker in a different department mentioned that he only ever heard this driver talking to or about me. Apparently, when I wasn't around, he would ask where I was or stay silent until I returned. Not long after, another coworker said he overheard the driver referring to me as his wife when I wasn't there. This revelation made me uncomfortable, so I decided to distance myself and stick strictly to business. I stopped engaging in any personal conversation with him, focusing only on the paperwork. I wasn't rude, just less friendly. One day, the driver became unusually friendly in the clerk's office, laying on his charm in front of others. Feeling cornered and unable to ignore his behavior, I finally responded by making it clear to him and to the other clerk present that we were not involved in any way and that I would keep all future interactions strictly professional. His reaction was immediate. He turned hostile. From that point on, every interaction became an attack on my personality. He'd say things like, "They must be working you too hard. You used to be so much more fun to be around." Or, "You used to be happy." I pride myself on being an outgoing, upbeat person, and his comments insinuated that I'd somehow changed or become unfriendly. His remarks bothered me, but the breaking point came when he began gossiping about me to others, calling me unprofessional simply because I was now keeping my distance. I decided to report his behavior to my boss. I explained how uncomfortable he was making me, how his behavior had forced me to alter my personality, and how he was now trying to tarnish my reputation. My boss took it seriously and filed a report. Things seemed to settle down for a while, though I occasionally heard from coworkers that he still made comments. Then, the phone call started. Every day, I'd receive calls from an unknown number at random times, sometimes at work, sometimes at home, and even in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was spam, but no one ever spoke. I couldn't block the number since it appeared as unknown, but I began to suspect the calls might be from him. I remembered he'd once bragged about playing pranks, like making anonymous calls or leaving things on people's porches, as part of his good old days. I began keeping an ear out for any comments he might make to coworkers, thinking he might slip up and reveal something. I even informed my friends in other departments, asking them to let me know if they heard him bragging about something that might connect him to the calls. But nothing came of it, and the calls continued. To keep my sanity, I started responding to the calls in a different way. When my phone rang, I'd answer by calling him out by name and letting him know exactly what I thought of him before hanging up. At work, I'd hold up my phone in his direction, silently daring him to react. I could tell it was bothering him, but he kept quiet. One weekend night, I was jolted awake by the light from my phone screen. It wasn't vibrating, just flashing as the screen turned on and off. When I saw the unknown caller, I rolled over and answered, prepared to give him an earful. But before I could speak, I heard a loud honk outside my house, and then, eerily, through the phone as well, I froze, realizing he was right outside. I peeked through the curtains to see his work truck parked in the middle of the street. As soon as he saw me look out, he hung up, revved his engine, and sped off into the night without another sound or a turnaround. Shaken, I stayed awake until morning, piecing together what I knew. By Monday, I had built a solid case against him and went straight to my boss. I explained that he must have accessed my personal information from work files, and because I'd already spoken with my boss about him once, there was now a documented history. My boss was horrified and filed a second report. This time, he made a direct announcement to the company and its partners about the situation. This sparked a larger investigation eventually revealing a disturbing network of harassers targeting various female employees. I work in retail, and there are only 5 of us in the store, including our manager. We're a very tight-knit team, almost like family, so we naturally have each other's backs for anything and everything. Tonight, my coworker and I were handling the store, but he needed to leave early for a dinner reservation with friends who had just arrived in town. So I offered to cover the last 30 minutes alone. We work in an area with a prominent homeless population, most of whom are kind and pleasant. However, just a few minutes after my coworker left, a man entered the store who immediately set my nerves on edge. He was around 6.5 feet tall, heavily built, and generally intimidating. To add to the unsettling vibe, he was holding a big gulp cup in one hand and a golf club in the other, with nothing else on him. As a shorter, smaller female, I felt on edge. Yet, as part of my job, I needed to be friendly and engage with customers, so I initiated conversation, hoping he'd reveal himself to be harmless, maybe someone who'd just come back from the driving range. However, I quickly realized how wrong I was. The man still had a hospital bracelet on from what he said was a 2-month stay in a mental hospital. He became overly interested in me, asking intrusive questions about every aspect of my life. First, he asked what I was studying, and when I mentioned psychiatry, his demeanor changed instantly, as though an alarm had gone off in his head. His expression hardened. While my heart goes out to people in difficult situations like his, I couldn't shake the vulnerable feeling I had with him in the store, especially now that he was visibly agitated. The questions came rapid fire. What's your name? Where do you live? Where do you go to school? When do you work? How often do you work? When is your next break? How old are you? Do you live alone? Is anyone else here? I lied in response to each question, giving only vague answers to try and divert him. When he asked for my phone number, I provided the store's number, and I told him my name was actually my manager's, hoping it would redirect any further contact attempts. Luckily, I managed to guide him toward the exit as closing time approached. As a precaution, I altered my appearance before leaving, changing my clothes and styling my hair differently to be less recognizable. Fortunately, I did, because when I stepped outside, I saw him waiting in the alley out back. I tried to act casual and not make eye contact, heading straight to my car parked across the street. As I reached the crosswalk, he emerged from the alley and started following me. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to focus on the glowing crosswalk signal ahead. When it finally changed, I began to walk, only to hear him sprinting up behind me. With no one else around, I was sure he was about to attack, maybe hit me in the head or the knee, and drag me back into the alley. At that moment, I finally turned around and saw him standing at the edge of the sidewalk, just staring at me. He could see my face now, and he muttered something under his breath before starting to follow me again. He even called out the fake name I'd given him, but I didn't respond. Instead, I quickened my pace, hurrying toward my car. His footsteps grew closer, and I knew he was gaining on me. Just as he seemed to be almost on top of me, I broke into a sprint toward my car. My sudden burst of speed must have surprised him, as he hesitated momentarily. This hesitation gave me the chance I needed. I reached my car, managed to get the door unlocked, and threw myself inside, my hands shaking. As I closed the door and locked it, I saw his hand gripping the golf club, and he was so close that I could read the print on his hospital bracelet. My knees went weak, and I collapsed into the driver's seat just as the golf club swung down and whistled past where my head had been a second before. Pure terror, rather than any sort of instinct, had saved me. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sped out of the parking lot. After reaching a safe distance, I called the police and then my manager. The man was picked up and booked that night, and I later had to identify him at the police station. The entire experience taught me to always trust my gut. No matter how friendly or professional your job requires you to be, safety should always come first.